Good morning, Joe-san, or good afternoon. My name is Bill Jeffrey. I'm a associate professor at the University of Guam in Micronesia, and I'll be talking to you about in an introduction to maritime archaeology. I have a background in maritime archaeology from Australia and in Micronesia and in Hong Kong from starting about 1980. So I've been and seen several sites and worked in different areas, and I'll give you an introduction on maritime archaeology with some examples around the world and in Hong Kong. So what is maritime archaeology? Is it a maritime version of what you see in the Indiana Jones movies, with lots of adventure and looking for famous artifacts to keep for themselves, such as you see here Harrison Ford playing Indiana Jones on the left here? Or is it the things you see in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, where you have old sailing ships, treasure, battles, and that sort of thing? Yes, it can include some of those things, but much, much, much more. Archaeology is the systematic study of the material things left by humans. All sorts of things, buildings, and I've just named a few of them here. Ruins of buildings and bridges and so on, portable objects, all the things that people leave behind. And it include cultural landscapes where the material thing is still in the landscape, and it's that connection with the landscape that's important. Maritime archaeology is therefore the systematic study of the material things that are of a maritime nature. And they can include shipwrecks, fish weirs, lighthouses, wharves, anything on land or underwater that have a maritime connection. And you can see here the picture of the globe from a Pacific view. It's the oceans cover about 70% of our world. So the potential for maritime archaeology is very enormous and very exciting. UNESCO estimate there are about 3 million shipwrecks worldwide. With only, I think, my guess is that maybe 10,000 have been found. So the potential is enormous. But maritime archaeology can be adventurous. It can be fun to do. It can involve lots of travel, where we learn about the world's cultural diversity. And the main differences with the Indiana Jones style archaeology is that archaeologists employ a systematic study where everything is recorded and written up for others to see. There's lots of paperwork in maritime archaeology. The material things are not for buying and selling though. They may belong to someone, or it's a public heritage from which everyone should be able to benefit. Either we leave it in situ and see it and dive on it in situ, or we put it into a museum after a lengthy conservation process. And engaging with many other people is a big part of doing maritime archaeology, including those associated with the heritage. And part of our work is to help preserve those associated cultural practices and the associated stories. A major aim, therefore, is to learn about how people lived, but how they live today, because how we live today is based on how we lived in the past and why we live this way. And it can include many, many issues. And it has also a very strong history connection of being able to sort of provide how the history of people and events can be found. Material from underwater wet sites can be of exceptional quality. You see some examples here of this flintlock gun that's been totally concreted, and after careful conservation, the 300-year-old gun is virtually intact. And there's some examples here of a 1,000-year-old. This is a 1,000-year-old green splashware jar from the Belatung ship, which I'll talk about later. There's also ceramics from this Korean ship, actually on site or in situ, and you can see very good, well intact material. And this came out in a study that the UK, the British did about sites underwater compared to sites on land. At the top here we have the inorganic material. Down the bottom here, the organics, the woods, the plants. And you can see the percentage of the material found on underwater sites for that material, organics, is much, much higher compared to land sites. 70% as against maybe 10% for land sites. So material from underwater sites can be of exceptional quality. Dr. George Bass is considered the pioneer of doing underwater archaeology, which he commenced in the 1960s. A lot of his work is in the Mediterranean, and there's a list of 4 sites that he's worked on that date back 3,400 years, this Phoenician ship off Uluburun in Turkey. And his meticulous recording, this is a section of some timber remains down in the bottom left here. He meticulously recorded that for thousands of hours and was able to recreate the vessel. And in context with the cargo, these are some copper ingots that were on this ship from Uluburun. He was able to put them into context and say which was carried aboard, what was carried aboard, where was it carried, and relive sort of life aboard a ship. And his work really has rewritten the history of the Eastern Mediterranean trade. Such is the value of doing archaeology. And I'd like to provide a few examples, just a few of the maybe 10,000 or 20,000 shipwrecks and other sites around the world, and start with this one called the Sutton Hoo. There is a movie actually you find on Netflix called The Dig, based on the finding of this site. But it was a massive mound that was used as a burial mound. And the king, Anglo-Saxon king, was actually buried within the mound in a ship. So you can see the remains of the ship here. This is the ship actually is gone, but it's left this sort of remains there from the mud, how it was pressed into the mud. And you get lots of the cargo, the burial goods that were put into the ship with the Anglo-Saxon king to take into the afterlife were found with him. Such as the importance of this, it was seen as the greatest collection of those sorts of artifacts in Britain in 1939 when it was found. Probably one of the biggest initiatives or catalysts for doing maritime archaeology was the invention of the scuba tank, what was called then by Jacques Cousteau the aqualung, who invented it in 1942. And you can see an early slide of him looking at some jars in the Mediterranean, the sort of jars that George Bass was excavating, these amphora carrying wine, seeds, grapes, whole range of things. And then you can see an impression of him working in one of his sites and just how much scuba tank was used and the different facilities that he employed when he was working on one of these sites in the Mediterranean. A big catalyst for doing maritime archaeology was the finding of the Swedish warship, the Vasa, in Stockholm harbour. This ship sunk within minutes of being launched. Not sure why, but water got into it and it sunk in 1628. In the Stockholm harbour, the soil, the sand, the silt covered up this sort of site over a period of time, which really helped preserve it. And the dark, dirty water, there's no light, there's lack of oxygen, and there was lack of interference by anyone for many years. Found this site when they excavated it and recovered it in 1961 be of exceptional quality, and it's now in the Stockholm Museum. Really a lovely site to go and see. So much of this, probably 70-80% of this is original. They've added some of the figures and scroll work to illustrate how it was equipped and built and used. If we move into the Asia Pacific area, this is a list of shipwrecks provided by my colleague Wu Ming of sites related to the 9th to the 15th century. That is sites that before European contact. And you can see there are a lot of ships that have been found as shipwrecks because there was a lot of trade in this little region. So these are mostly names of where the sites are found. Then in the later period when the Europeans came in, you'll see some of the names of the ships from the 16th century onwards. And so this is the main ships that have been found and worked on in the sort of area that we're mainly interested in. Hong Kong is in this sort of area here. So there's some sites that are quite close to Hong Kong, and some of them I'll talk about, which is this one, the Nanhai No. 1 shipwreck. A purpose-built museum was built for something like 2 billion yuan, and here you can see it here. And the ship was totally excavated, put into like a big container, a ship's container, and then that was found 15 miles out to sea, and then brought inside this area here, which is like a big swimming pool. And they pumped out the water because they found that they couldn't really excavate it all that well. The aim was to try and excavate it in the water. They could show people in the museum how it's done, but they had problems with a number of things. So they pumped the water out and excavated the shipwreck as a land archaeological dig. I'm not going to play the YouTube video, but you can look at that at your leisure. And it's a 2-minute version of about finding the Nanhai No. 1 and bringing it ashore. But this is a close-up of the ship. These are the bulkheads going across. This is one side of the ship, the other side is over there. And you can see some of the ceramic cargo, something like 100,000 ceramics, and many, many of them intact were found, and various types of ceramics. The ship was from the Song dynasty. It was leaving China, and probably picked up this cargo from various ports, and then sailed out and was sunk not far south of Hong Kong, off this island of Zhangyang. And just some of the cargo, which was bound for the Middle East here, it's in remarkable condition. Come from some of these famous kilns in China, including some really beautiful gold pieces. And you can see it has a Middle Eastern orientation or design to it. It was all done in China. It was probably on order, sort of like we order now from Amazon or somewhere. Here they were ordering the stuff and getting Chinese to make it, and then it was travelling out of China to the Middle East and never got much past Hong Kong. Another famous shipwreck in the area of Southeast Asia is in Indonesia. It's a ship called the Belitung. The Belitung is the name of the island. We don't know the name of the ship, but you can see a small model of it here. It was an Arab ship that was sailing, again, out of China with a large collection of ceramics. And there's a really nice inscription on one of the bowls that dated it to just around 826. So the shipwreck probably sailed within a few years of 826 after it. Unfortunately, this was a commercial exploitation. This was a job that was under license from the Indonesian government, but they were going to sell it, material. Such was the importance of it that the people who had the license and that did the work said that this collection should not be split up, as is normally done with treasure hunting jobs. And so the Singapore government eventually bought it for just over $20 million, I think. And there's some of the Changsha ware bowls that are on display in Singapore. And a beautiful poem on one of the bowls. But many of these paintings and motifs are of Arabic style. So again, done in China, made in China with this Chinese really, there was no one matching the Chinese for doing ceramics at this time. So again, made there and then being transported to somewhere in the Middle East. But it's not all about shipwrecks, maritime archaeology. And this is just some of the other types of sites. Something that I'm quite interested in is these fish weirs, and I work in Yap in the Faroe States of Micronesia. But fish weirs made of stone, some like these Indonesian ones are made of brushwood and other several hundred years of old, and they're really a strong connection with local people even today. They illustrate the living heritage, but also the traditional ecological knowledge that the people had then, that to some extent they've lost, and they're trying to revive. Many other parts of the world, they lost that TEK a long time ago, but these are great to help bring back that traditional ecological knowledge, which I think is very important this day of we have our sea and the loss of fish and the environment being exploited, that we really need to get back to something, not using fish weirs, maybe using fish weirs, but at least understanding the TEK implications. Other types of sites, and this is just a small smattering of some of them, a famous lighthouse. There's the Pharos of Alexandria, 2,000-year-old lighthouse in Egypt. And this is an illustration here that they would have had a big fire up the top with a bronze mirror that could see out to sea maybe 20 miles or so. So at nighttime when it's pitch black, they'd be sailing, they'd be able to see that and know where to come to the port. Other types of sites, we have something like sunken villages, something that you're interested in the reservoirs. This is Port Royal. This is a city in Jamaica, in Jamaica that was sunk by a big earthquake and then tidal wave, and some American maritime archaeologists are exploring this site. They can swim down what were the roads, because now the city is sort of sunk underwater, and they can swim down the streets and carry out their work underwater. Other types of sites, the paintings, rock carvings. These are just two illustrations of paintings that can have a maritime connection. And it's not all about the material things. As I said, intangible, immaterial, or what's called living heritage is an important part of doing maritime archaeology. I think especially in the Asia-Pacific region, in Hong Kong, but in Micronesia where I am. And just an illustration of what is important to people here and other parts of the world is this the revival of traditional sailing, building those types of boats, but also how you sail them, what sort of navigation do you use. And they didn't have charts. They did have some sort of a chart which they never took at sea, but those sorts of connections are something that should be and are associated or are focus for maritime archaeology in various parts of the world. Something that's also of importance out in Micronesia, as it is in parts of Hong Kong and Asia, World War II shipwrecks. We know from a database there's about 3,800 World War II shipwrecks in Asia Pacific. And it's the in situ preservation that's a focus, meaning that we'd like to preserve it in situ so people can go and dive those sites. Sometimes we may excavate the artefacts, but generally these ships are big ships, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 tons. Too big to excavate, yet leave them in situ. People can enjoy diving them. The local people can enjoy, the economic benefits from people coming to dive those sites. This is a small ship in Micronesia that I've worked on. This is a pole and line fishing vessel that was converted during World War II in Chuuk Lagoon, and I think it's this little vessel here to help the Japanese during World War II. And this is a 3D model of this little vessel, about 100 foot long, 30 metres long. So I have a little model of it here that I'd like to show you. This is something that could be done, and we do now quite a bit, this 3D photogrammetry, where we might take thousands of overlapping photographs to recreate these 3D models that can help display material for people that can't dive, but help in our recording of these sites. Again, this is in about 14, 16 metres of water in Chuuk Lagoon, really clear water. But the model, whether it's clear or not, can be still turned out very good quality. So we actually don't need clear water, but it's a benefit if we have it. And what we can produce from, whoops, I'll just stop it there, move to the next slide. What we can produce from that is this orthographic image. So it's a bird's eye view. It's like producing a map. So we can use those 3D models to produce these orthophotos that can be turned into a site plan. During World War II, fighting battles at sea wasn't from battleships. In the early days it was. This is, hundreds, thousands of years, most of the battles at sea were ships firing each other. From World War II onwards, it was aircraft being launched from aircraft carriers that were fighting the battles. So there are many aircraft remains in Asia Pacific and around the world that are a focus for maritime archaeology. And just highlighting, this is another lighthouse in Micronesia. This is also a focus for our work in maritime archaeology in Micronesia. But ships were and still are extremely important. And you can see how they still are by this screenshot from this marine traffic website of all the vessels sailing. This is probably a week ago that I did this, and I did a screen or a drop on one of these vessels heading or coming out of Hong Kong or going into Hong Kong, and up the top right you can see the longitude and latitude of it. But ships still are, but even more so before aircraft were invented and used, they were extremely important. And this is why many maritime archaeologists still have this focus on shipwrecks, even though there's much other work that can be done. There are many laws associated with doing maritime archaeology in various countries, as in Hong Kong. And one law I'd like to sort of or one agreement that I would like to highlight is this UNESCO Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage. The discovery of the Titanic, and most of you would know the Titanic discovery. It was a graveyard for 2,000 to 3,000 people. It was lost in 1912. It was found in 1985. And unfortunately, because it wasn't within a country's jurisdiction, it was out in the territory, outside in the territorial sea in international waters, many people started to go there and take material off it. It was that site and other sites, especially sites in Asia Pacific, like the collection that was carried out from this. It was actually a Dutch ship carrying these Chinese ceramics and gold back to Holland. Exploitation of that, where this material was sold at auction for something like 20 million, and other sites in Florida that were being commercially exploited. That was a catalyst for this law. Countries got together and they said, well, we need to stop this. So they developed this sort of agreement, which now 70 countries have ratified. So it's seen as the peak law agreement, how to do maritime archaeology. It has what's called the rules as an attachment to it, where it sort of outlines how to go about doing maritime archaeology, as well as the front part, 10 pages or so, which is guiding principles of maritime archaeology. And here's some of the dot points associated with some of these guiding principles, where material it has to be of cultural, historical, and archaeological character, totally or partially underwater, and have been there for 100 years. But World War II sites are not 100 years old. So if a country, if they would like to protect those World War II sites, such as in Micronesia, where a very important part of their heritage, they can. So it doesn't have to be 100 years old. And some of the other points here, some of the main points I just highlight. Preservation in situ is the first priority, not the only priority, but the first priority. So you stop, manage it in situ, then maybe you can carry on doing some excavation if it's the significance is of archaeological significance. And a big principle is that underwater cultural heritage should not be commercially exploited. That means going and excavating material, then selling it, trading whatever that material. As I said, it could be owned by someone, and really then the public also lose out if this material is split up around the world. So some other points there. Encouraging public access is a big part of this program. And there's some other things. Respect given to human remains. Many sites can have human remains on them, especially the World War II sites. So this now is seen as a bit of a guiding agreement. Many countries have their domestic legislation, as I said, like in Hong Kong, like here in Guam, many countries, and these need to be compatible with what's the UNESCO Convention. Well, so what processes are used in maritime archaeology? And I've just put some dot points here about these processes. First of all, we need to develop a research plan or a project design. What are we going to do? And how are we going to go about it? Needs to be in the sort of research plan, project design. We need to implement some archival research and historical documents, but also oral histories. This is very important in places like Hong Kong and in Micronesia, where I'm from, where people still have this strong connection with the sea and have oral histories associated with the sea. Do we need to search for a site? Use remote sensing equipment, like ROVs? Or can we use just divers? Is it not that deep that we can search for it with divers? Do we need to implement a site survey and prepare a site plan? Yes, this is the very first step in your survey work, a site plan. Do we need to excavate or just a non-disturbance survey, such as the villages submerged in the reservoirs? It's just the non-disturbance survey work it's your aim. This is your part of your project design research plan. So we don't excavate, but there are many sites that we want to excavate for certain reasons. We might want to carry on and do further research after we've done some survey work because we've found out many things, and then we must write up this information in terms of report, journal articles, websites, books, and whatever. We need to get the information out to people. Also put material into a museum if it can't be looked at in situ. Very important. So this is just an illustration of some of the methods we can use for searching. Number one here is the proton magnetometer, where we're measuring the Earth's magnetic field. And if we have a ferrous, just an iron shipwreck, such as a World War II, the change in the Earth's magnetic field would be picked up by this proton magnetometer, and we would see it in a computer screen in the boat. This number two is the side scan sonar. Number one, the material can be buried. Number two, material has to be on the seabed for us to discern it. So it sends out this sound waves from various wavelengths, 100 to 400 megahertz, and in this fan shape. So it covers maybe 100 meters across, and we can see things that stick up off the seabed. Another sub-bottom device is this low sound frequency boomer or sub-bottom profiler, and this goes through sand. If something like a shipwreck is there, it's reflected off that. Also reflected off of rock, so you need to be careful about discerning from this one. So really an experienced person needs to be looking at this one in particular, but these others fairly simple. and maritime archaeologists use those a lot, particularly the side scan and the magnetometer, and increasingly the ROVs, because of the technology advancing all the time and getting cheaper and cheaper, more affordable ROVs. So we found a site. What we do a non-disturbance survey and research, or is it of archaeological importance and significance, and therefore we can carry out an excavation. And this is a really simplistic version of some people doing some excavation, that the area was gridded off. Anything that's recovered here is recorded, and generally in 3 dimensions. So this is a airlift or a water pump where the generally use water and pump water down here, put it up this hard PVC pipe that creates a suction, and we can remove the sand carefully to reveal the artifacts that are then recorded. We then put into a container, small container with the number, and then put into a larger container and attached to like a balloon filled with air, and this will just rise up and take our material up to the water surface, the level. In Hong Kong, we have looked at developing this database from the UK's and the Hong Kong Hydrographic Office database, with something like 240 sites, and we've looked at only a few of these, and some of the sites we've added to because we've found them through our research. But you can find this online with the Hong Kong Underwater Heritage Group website, this database, and you can click on each one of those. And quite a few we don't know. There's several we do, as I said, and you can find out more information from that. But if we go back, this is something that came up from people doing land archaeology. This was an old, maybe 7,000 years old. It's been dated to about 3 or 4,000 years old. But it's a core. It's where people broke off, flaked off, chipped off these flakes that they would then make into tools. And you can click on this link here and do a 3D look at this lithic core, stone tool core that we found in, it was found, we just went and had a look. First time we had a look at this was in about 1 metre of water over the top of it. Now we went back a few years later and saw it high and dry. But you can see how these flakes would have come off it. Some of the other work that we've done in Hong Kong are the non-disturbance survey work of a shipwreck that we found from the database and went and had a look, and just to build up our expertise, or build up the group's expertise, Hong Kong Underwater Heritage Group. And this is as I said, the site plan is a very, very important first step. We did the survey of this wooden vessel. It's a modern fishing vessel that I think is from the remains. It looks like it's been dynamited, maybe so it couldn't be looked at systematically for maybe insurance purposes. So that's from the group of about 6 of us, working 3 dives a day for over 2 weekends that we needed to put this together. So it's an accurate site plan, the very first step in doing maritime archaeology. Another project we've done in Hong Kong is the area off of Town Island, where a diver told us about material that he was finding. So we went there over a few periods of time. The last one was 2014, when we did a series of trenches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 trenches. A couple of we didn't use, but we found several of these, what were Qing and some Ming and some Yuan dynasty artifacts. Here you can see some of the group members doing the work underwater, doing baseline offset, recording every artifact with a number, put into a box or container or plastic bag and brought up like that. And then every artifact with that number was put onto the artifact, and all this material was handed over to AMO, the Antiquities and Monuments Office. We actually did the conservation work, or the group did the conservation work themselves. We only had, in the first few days, or the first work we did on the site was only a few artefacts, but then in 2014 we had quite a few. So fortunately we had the assistance of Paul Harrison, who was then with the Hong Kong Maritime Museum and helped in the conservation work of those 300 odd artefacts. He helped train a number of Hong Kong people. We had a few people from Australia also come to help us in that work. A big part of what was important was the artefact documentation. This was a disturbance project. We excavated. We didn't actually dig. The soil material was found on the seabed, and we recovered those 340 artefacts, and several of them were drawn up like this very important part of putting a report together that we're able to show how these artefacts looked, and any sort of markings on them were carefully looked at and drawn up in the drawings. A couple of other projects, briefly, I'll finish off soon in the next couple of slides, but with working with divers in that sort of project, the Town Island project, they told us about a few other sites. We went and had a look at this cannon site, and the two cannons sit side by side off Basalt Island, and we recovered both cannons. Paul Harrison Museum conserved them, and they're on display here in the Hong Kong Maritime Museum. And this is some of the team, Hong Kong Underwater Heritage Group and other members, when we did the recovery. I just have a bit of a low-vis view of Paul Harrison deconcreting this cannon, just to show you that sort of process of deconcreting. This is concretion that builds up its material. It's algae that helps bind animals that are living and then dying, and maybe 1 to 2 centimeters of concretion builds up, and this helps preserve the material. If this material wasn't there and didn't help protect it, maybe we wouldn't have the markings that we have found on this cannon. So this is a speeded up low res version of the cannon and Paul doing the deconcretion. Another project to finish off is the Song Dynasty anchor stock that we found. Other divers, we went looking for material and found some ceramics, but the really interesting thing that we found nearby was this small 1.6 metre long basalt stone anchor stock. So this is the stock that's here from this exhibit or display that's in the Japanese museum. This is from the Yuan dynasty. So this is a Song which is earlier. We found, or this one just exactly the same like this, but a bit bigger in the Nanhai No. 1 Museum. And this is at the Song Dynasty anchor stock at the Hong Kong Maritime Museum. So it's about 1,000 years old. So far it looks like the oldest artefact to come out of the water in Hong Kong waters. So summing up, there are considerable opportunities and challenges in doing maritime archaeology in Hong Kong. There's considerable interest from the community, from schools such as yours, to work and to look at preserving maritime archaeology or site underwater cultural heritage or shipwrecks. There are many types of sites. Hong Kong was, was settled thousands of years ago by people crossing the water, or maybe walking across before the water rose up. But there, since then, many other types of sites and people associated with the water. There are laws that help protect sites, but there's really no active government program that helps it. We've got some funding through other various sources, Lord Wilson Heritage Trust, for Hong Kong Underwater Heritage Group to do our work, but much more is needed. And the program really needs ongoing support. And I'm very happy to see your school and students, teachers getting interested and wanting to be part of this. Maybe one day in the future, you'll be some of you will be maritime archaeologists that could be employed by Hong Kong government or maybe some other government elsewhere. So thank you very much. Please, if you have any questions, Rick, the people at Hong Kong Underwater Heritage Group know where to find me. So I hope the rest of your project goes well. Thank you very much.